The Longhouse at the edge of the fjord. More than 1,000 years ago, during the time historians now call the Viking Age, the landscape of Scandinavia looked very different from today. Dense forests covered the hills, cold winds swept across rocky coastlines, and long fjords carved deep into the land like the fingers of the sea reaching inland. Near one of these fjords stood the most important building in any Viking settlement, the Longhouse. From a distance, it might have looked simple. A long, low building with a curved roof made of thatch or turf, its wooden frame darkened by years of smoke and weather. But inside that structure existed an entire world. The Longhouse was not just a building, it was a home, a workshop, a gathering hall, a place of storytelling, and sometimes even a center of political power. To understand Viking life, you must first understand the Longhouse. Most Viking families lived together under one roof. A single longhouse could hold parents, children, grandparents, servants, and sometimes even animals. The building stretched long and narrow, often between 60 and 200 feet in length. The walls were made from heavy wooden posts driven deep into the ground, with woven branches and packed clay filling the gaps. The roof was thick and heavy. Vikings often covered it with layers of grass and soil, creating what looked almost like a living hill. In summer, grass sometimes even grew on the roof. But the most striking feature of a Viking longhouse was the smoke. There were no chimneys. Inside the house, fires burned almost constantly. The smoke slowly drifted upward and escaped through small openings in the roof. Over time, the interior beams became black with soot, and the air inside often smelled strongly of wood smoke. Yet to the Vikings, this was the smell of home. At the center of the longhouse ran a long stone-lined fire pit. This hearth provided heat during the freezing winters of Scandinavia. It was also where meals were cooked, iron tools were heated, and stories were told late into the night. Benches lined the walls on both sides of the hall. During the day, people sat there to work, repair tools, weave cloth, or carve wood. At night, the same benches became sleeping places, covered with furs and blankets. Light inside the longhouse was dim. Small oil lamps and the central fire cast flickering shadows across the walls. The glow reflected off wooden shields hanging from beams and metal tools resting nearby. Children grew up in this smoky half-light. They watched their fathers sharpen axes and repair ships. They watched their mothers spin wool and prepare food. And they listened carefully to the stories told by the elders of the family. Stories about raids across the sea. Stories about storms and battles. Stories about the gods. The Vikings believed strongly in their gods, especially powerful figures like Odin and Thor. Sometimes small wooden carvings of these gods were kept inside the longhouse. Offerings of food or drink might be placed near them during important moments of the year. The longhouse was therefore not just a home, it was also a sacred place where family traditions were passed from one generation to the next. Life inside these buildings followed the rhythm of the seasons. During summer, many people spent most of their time outside, farming, fishing, or building ships. But when winter came and snow covered the land, the longhouse became the center of life. For months, families remained mostly indoors. They repaired tools, they prepared weapons, they wove cloth, they told long stories to pass the dark hours. And sometimes, when important guests arrived, the quiet life of the longhouse changed completely. A chieftain might invite neighboring warriors for a great feast.
Long wooden tables would be placed near the fire, and servants would bring roasted meat, bread, and ale. Horn cups filled with drink would pass from hand to hand. Music and laughter would fill the smoky hall. These gatherings were more than celebrations. They helped build alliances and strengthen loyalty between warriors and their leaders. Some of the largest and most powerful longhouses belonged to Viking chieftains. These halls were symbols of authority. Travelers approaching the settlement could immediately recognize which building belonged to the local leader. Inside those halls, decisions were made that could affect entire villages, and sometimes even determine whether ships would sail across the sea for trade or war. But most longhouses were not halls of kings or chieftains. They were simply homes, places where ordinary people lived difficult but meaningful lives. Inside those walls, children were born, elders passed away, and families struggled together through long winters and uncertain harvests. The Longhouse protected them from the cold winds of Scandinavia. It protected them from storms, and perhaps most importantly, it kept the family together. Because in Viking society, family was everything. The Longhouse stood as a physical symbol of that unity, a shared space where every member of the household had a role and a responsibility. Yet, even though the Longhouse seemed simple, archaeologists today continue to discover new secrets hidden beneath the soil of Scandinavia. Ancient foundations reveal details about how these buildings were constructed, how they changed over time, and how Viking communities organized their lives. What once appeared to be just wooden halls were actually complex centers of daily life, and many mysteries about them still remain. Some of those mysteries lie in the tools and objects that filled these homes. Others are hidden in the layout of the buildings themselves. But perhaps the most fascinating secrets are found in the people who lived there. The craftsmen, farmers, warriors, and storytellers whose lives shaped the Viking world. And to truly understand that world, we must step deeper inside the Longhouse. Because the fire at its center was only the beginning.
The Viking Longhouse may appear simple at first glance, but behind its rugged wooden walls lay a surprisingly sophisticated design. Every beam, every doorway, and every section of the building served a purpose. The architecture of these houses was not random. It was shaped by centuries of experience living in the harsh environment of Northern Europe during the time historians call the Viking Age. Across the cold lands of Scandinavia, where winters could last for many months and storms could arrive without warning, building a strong home was not simply about comfort, it was about survival. Viking builders understood their environment deeply. The materials they used came directly from the forests, rivers, and fields around them. Timber from tall pine and oak trees formed the skeleton of the Longhouse. These trees were carefully chosen because their wood was strong enough to support heavy roofs and strong enough to withstand the powerful winds that swept across the fjords of Norway and the coastal plains of Denmark. Construction of a longhouse usually began with the most important feature of the building, the support posts. Massive wooden posts were driven deep into the earth in two long parallel rows. These posts created the central frame of the building. Once they were in place, horizontal beams were attached across them, forming the ribs of the structure. This framework carried the enormous weight of the roof. The roof itself was one of the most impressive elements of Viking architecture. Instead of thin coverings, Vikings built thick, layered roofs designed to trap heat inside the house. Wooden rafters stretched from the central beams down toward the walls, forming a long triangular shape that helped snow slide off during winter storms.
Over these rafters, Vikings placed wooden planks, birch bark, and finally thick layers of turf and grass. This turf roof acted as natural insulation. During freezing winters, the layers of soil helped keep the warmth of the central fire inside the house. In summer, the same roof kept the interior cool. From the outside, a completed longhouse sometimes looked like a grassy mound rising from the ground. Inside, the structure was carefully divided into functional spaces. The center of the house held the hearth, the long fire pit that provided warmth and light. Smoke slowly drifted upward through small openings in the roof, creating the dim, smoky atmosphere typical of Viking homes. But the fire pit was only one part of a carefully planned interior. The longhouse was usually divided into 3 main zones. The central hall was the heart of the building. This is where daily life happened. Families gathered around the fire, meals were prepared, and stories were shared. On one side of the hall were sleeping platforms built along the walls. These wooden benches served many purposes. During the day, they were used as seats or work surfaces. At night, they became beds, covered with animal skins, wool blankets, and sometimes feather-filled bedding for wealthier families. The far ends of the longhouse often served different purposes, depending on the household. In smaller farms, one end of the building might house animals, such as goats, sheep, or cattle. Keeping animals inside during winter provided an important benefit. Their body heat helped warm the building. In the freezing climates of Northern Europe, this simple strategy could make a significant difference. In larger settlements, especially those ruled by powerful chieftains, the longhouse could be much larger and more complex. These great halls sometimes had separate rooms for storage, weapon racks, or guest sleeping areas. These halls could stretch over 200 feet long and were symbols of authority and wealth. Some of the most impressive examples of such structures have been discovered in archaeological sites in Sweden and Norway, where massive post holes in the ground reveal the size of buildings that once dominated Viking villages. But building a longhouse was not a quick project. Construction required cooperation from the entire community. Cutting timber, transporting beams, and assembling the frame demanded strength and coordination. Men, women, and even older children often helped gather materials and prepare the construction site. The process could take weeks or even months. Yet the Vikings did not rely on written plans or blueprints. Their architectural knowledge was passed down through generations. Experienced builders learned from their fathers and grandfathers, remembering the correct proportions and techniques needed to create a strong structure. This knowledge formed part of the practical wisdom that allowed Viking societies to thrive in difficult conditions. Another clever architectural feature of longhouses was their curved shape. Many Viking longhouses were not perfectly straight. Instead, their walls bowed outward along the length of the building. This shape increased the interior space while also strengthening the structure against wind pressure. The design also helped distribute the weight of the roof more evenly across the supporting beams. Doorways were usually placed along the sides of the building rather than at the ends. This design prevented strong winds from blowing directly through the length of the house. Often there were 2 main entrances positioned opposite each other along the walls. These entrances allowed smoke and fresh air to circulate through the building. Despite the smoky environment, Viking longhouses were surprisingly comfortable compared to many other early medieval homes across Europe. Thick walls blocked the wind, turf roofs insulated the interior, and the constant fire kept temperatures manageable even during the coldest months. Still, life inside the longhouse was never quiet. The sounds of daily activity filled the hall. The crackling of firewood, the clinking of metal tools, the murmuring of conversation, and sometimes the restless movements of animals nearby created a constant background noise. For children growing up in these homes, the Longhouse was their entire world. They learned to walk along the wooden floors, played near the warmth of the hearth, and listened as elders spoke of distant lands and legendary warriors. Stories of powerful gods such as Thor and wise wanderers like Odin echoed through the smoky air during long winter nights. The Longhouse, therefore, served more than a building. It was the center of Viking life. Within its walls, architecture, culture, survival, and storytelling all came together. Every part of the structure supported the people who lived inside it. But the physical building was only half of the story, because once the doors closed and the fire was burning brightly, the true life of the Longhouse began. Inside these halls, families worked together, crafted tools and clothing, prepared food for long winters, and maintained traditions that had been passed down for centuries. The hidden world inside Viking Longhouses was filled with activity, skill, and quiet resilience. And in the next part of the story, we will step closer to the fire and explore something just as important as the building itself: the people who lived within it.
Inside every Viking longhouse lived an entire community. The building itself may have been made of timber, turf, and earth, but it was the people inside who truly brought it to life. During the time known as the Viking Age, these longhouses across Scandinavia were filled with families whose daily routines shaped the rhythm of Viking society. A longhouse was rarely home to just a small family. Instead, it was the center of an extended household. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes distant relatives lived together under the same roof. Servants or workers might also share the space, especially on larger farms. The leader of the household was usually the oldest male family member. In many cases, this was the father or grandfather. He was responsible for making major decisions about farming, trade, and protection of the household. His authority was respected not only inside the home, but often within the wider village as well. But life inside the longhouse did not revolve around one person alone. Every member of the household had important responsibilities. Women played a powerful and respected role in Viking homes. The woman who managed the household, often called the housewife or mistress of the house, controlled the daily operation of the longhouse. She managed food supplies, organized the preparation of meals, and supervised the work that kept the household running. Keys hanging from a woman's belt symbolized her authority over the home's storage chests and supplies. These keys were more than practical tools. They represented trust and responsibility within the family. Women also produced many of the essential goods needed for survival. Spinning wool into thread and weaving cloth were daily tasks. Viking clothing, sails for ships, blankets, and ropes all depended on skilled textile work. These tasks required patience and expertise, and women spent long hours near the fire, working with spindles and looms. While women managed the household economy, men often worked outside the longhouse. Farming was the most common occupation. The lands of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were not always easy to cultivate. Rocky soil and short growing seasons meant farmers had to plan carefully. They planted barley, rye, and oats, while also raising animals such as sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. Fishing also provided an important source of food, especially for settlements near fjords or the sea. Boats launched from the shore each morning brought back fish that would later be dried, smoked, or salted for storage. But the Vikings were not only farmers and fishermen. Some men were craftsmen who worked inside or near the longhouse during the colder months. Blacksmiths forged tools, knives, and weapons.
Woodworkers carved bowls, spoons, chests, and furniture. Leather workers produced shoes, belts, and protective gear. Each craft added something essential to the survival of the household. Children in Viking families grew up quickly. From an early age, they learned the skills needed to contribute to the family. Young boys might help with animals, fishing, or gathering firewood. Girls often learned spinning, weaving, and food preparation from their mothers. Education in Viking society was practical rather than formal. Knowledge passed directly from one generation to the next through observation and practice. Even play could serve as training. Boys sometimes played games that mimicked combat, practicing with wooden swords or small shields. These games helped prepare them for the responsibilities of adulthood, especially in a culture where warriors were respected members of society. The presence of warriors inside the Longhouse added another dimension to daily life. Some men in Viking society gained reputations as skilled fighters who joined raids or expeditions across the sea. These voyages could lead them to distant lands such as England, Ireland, or even as far as Constantinople. When warriors returned from these journeys, the Longhouse became a place of storytelling and celebration. They described strange cities, powerful rulers, and dangerous battles fought on foreign shores. These stories fascinated younger members of the household and helped spread knowledge about the wider world. But longhouses were not always filled with excitement. Much of daily life was quiet and repetitive. Tasks like grinding grain, repairing clothing, and maintaining tools required patience. Winter months especially could feel long and dark. During these colder seasons, families spent many hours together around the central fire. This time often became an opportunity for storytelling. Elders shared tales passed down through generations. Some stories described heroic warriors and great voyages. Others spoke of the gods who shaped the Viking understanding of the universe. Powerful figures like Thor, known for his thunderous hammer, and the wise wanderer Odin appeared frequently in these stories. These myths were more than entertainment. They helped explain natural events such as storms, seasons, and the movement of the sun and moon. The Longhouse, therefore, became a place where knowledge, belief, and tradition were preserved. Respect for elders was deeply important in Viking society. Older family members who could no longer perform heavy work still played valuable roles within the household. They passed on experience, guided younger generations, and helped maintain family history. Their memories connected the present to the past. Life inside the Longhouse was not always peaceful, however. Disagreements between family members could occur, especially in crowded spaces where privacy was limited. Yet strong family bonds and shared responsibilities usually kept households united. The survival of everyone depended on cooperation. A failed harvest, a harsh winter, or illness could threaten the entire household. During such times, families relied on one another for support. The Longhouse provided shelter, warmth, and a place where collective effort helped overcome hardship. Over time, these shared experiences strengthened the bonds between family members. Generations grew up within the same walls. Eventually, children became parents themselves, raising their own families in the same Longhouse where they had once played as young boys and girls. In this way, the building became more than a home. It became a symbol of continuity. The timber beams witnessed births, marriages, and the passing of elders. The fire in the center burned through countless seasons, connecting one generation to the next. And while the architecture of the Longhouse protected its inhabitants from the cold winds of Scandinavia,
It was the people inside who gave the structure its true meaning. Their work, their stories, and their traditions filled the hall with life. But among all these daily activities, one moment stood above the rest: the gathering around the central fire when food was prepared and shared. Because food inside the Longhouse was not just nourishment, it was the heart of Viking community. And in the next part of the story, we will explore the meals, cooking traditions, and hidden food culture that sustained Viking families through the long winters of the North.
Food, fire, and daily meals in the Longhouse. At the center of every Viking longhouse burned a fire. The flames danced over glowing embers, sending warmth through the hall and smoke slowly rising toward openings in the roof. This fire was not only for heat or light, it was the heart of daily life inside the home. During the time known as the Viking Age, food preparation inside Viking homes was closely tied to the design of the longhouse itself. The long, stone-lined hearth that stretched along the middle of the building allowed several pots to cook at once, while people gathered nearby to work, talk, and rest. The fire never completely died out. Keeping it alive was important, especially during the long winters across Scandinavia. A household might carefully maintain glowing embers through the night so that the fire could be easily revived the next morning. Without it, the longhouse would quickly become cold and dark. Cooking methods were simple but effective. Large iron or clay pots were hung above the fire using metal hooks attached to wooden beams. Inside these pots simmered soups and stews made from whatever ingredients were available at the time. These meals often included grains such as barley or rye, flour instead of using large ovens like those in later medieval towns. Vikings often baked flatbread on heated stones or metal plates near the fire. The smell of warm bread mixed with wood smoke must have filled the longhouse regularly. Meat was an important part of the Viking diet, but it was not eaten every day by everyone. Most families raised animals such as sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. These animals provided milk, cheese, and occasionally meat for special meals. Fish, however, was far more common. Communities living near the coastlines of Norway and Denmark relied heavily on fishing. Cod, herring, and salmon were caught in large numbers and preserved by drying or smoking so they could last through winter. Fish hung from wooden racks outside or above the fire inside the longhouse, where the smoke helped preserve it. Dairy products were also essential. Milk from cows and goats was turned into butter, cheese, and a sour fermented drink similar to yogurt. These foods could last longer than fresh milk and provided valuable nutrition during colder months. Vegetables played a larger role in Viking meals than many people imagine. Farmers grew crops such as cabbage, onions, peas, and beans in small fields near their homes. Wild plants gathered from forests and meadows added flavor and variety to meals. Berries, nuts, and herbs were also collected during warmer seasons. Food preservation was extremely important. Because winter could last many months in Northern Europe, families had to prepare carefully during the summer and autumn. Meat was salted or smoked, fish was dried, vegetables were stored in cool underground pits. These stored supplies filled wooden chests and barrels inside the longhouse. Meals were usually eaten twice a day. The first meal came in the morning after people began their daily work. This meal was often simple, perhaps consisting of leftover stew, bread, and dairy products. The main meal came later in the evening. As darkness settled outside and family members returned from their tasks, everyone gathered near the fire. Hot bowls of hot food were passed around while people sat on benches along the walls. Eating together was one of the most important moments of the day. It provided not only nourishment, but also time for conversation and storytelling. News about the village, plans for future work, and memories of past journeys were shared while the fire crackled nearby. Drinks were also part of these gatherings. Ale made from barley was the most common beverage. It was often safer to drink than water because the brewing process helped eliminate harmful bacteria. Mead made from honey was another popular drink, especially during celebrations. During special occasions, meals inside the Longhouse became much more elaborate. Festivals and seasonal celebrations brought extended families and neighbors together for large feasts. Whole animals might be roasted, large quantities of ale served, and music played late into the night. These feasts strengthened friendships and alliances within Viking communities. Some celebrations were connected to religious traditions, honoring powerful gods such as Thor or the wise god Odin. Food offerings and shared meals played an important role in these rituals. Guests visiting a longhouse were treated with great respect. Hospitality was a core value in Viking culture. A traveler arriving at a farmhouse might be invited inside, offered a warm seat near the fire, and given food even if supplies were limited. Refusing hospitality could damage a family's reputation. Because of this tradition, the Longhouse became not only a private home, but also a welcoming place for strangers, traders, and travelers passing through the region. Inside the smoky hall, people from distant lands sometimes shared stories about distant cities and cultures. Through these conversations, Viking households learned about places far beyond their own villages. Children often watched these gatherings with fascination. Sitting quietly near the fire, they listened as adults discussed farming, voyages, and rumors from across the sea. These moments formed their earliest understanding of the wider world. Cooking itself required skill and patience. Women, who usually managed food preparation, needed to understand how to preserve ingredients, control cooking temperatures, and plan meals that would stretch limited resources across the year. Their work was essential for the survival of the household. The fire, the food, and the shared meals created a rhythm of life inside the Longhouse that continued day after day, season after season. It was a rhythm built on cooperation. Everyone contributed something to the table, whether it was fish caught from the sea, grain harvested from the fields, or herbs gathered from the forest. Together, these efforts kept the household strong. Yet the Longhouse was not only a place for cooking and eating, it was also a place of work. Tools were repaired, clothing was made, and crafts were practiced within its walls during long winter months when outdoor labor became difficult. And in the next part of the story, we will explore the hidden workshops of the Longhouse, the tools, crafts, and skilled work that allowed Viking families to survive and thrive in the challenging world of Northern Europe.
Craft, tools, and the hidden workshops of the Longhouse. Inside the Viking Longhouse, daily life was never idle. Even during the long winters when snow covered the fields and icy winds swept across the northern seas, the interior of the house remained busy. The Longhouse was not only a home, it also functioned as a small workshop where many of the tools and goods needed for survival were created. During the time historians call the Viking Age, families living across Scandinavia relied heavily on their own skills. Unlike modern societies where people buy many of their tools and clothing, Viking households often produced much of what they needed themselves. This meant that the Longhouse was constantly filled with quiet but purposeful activity. Along the walls of the building, wooden chests stored tools used for crafting and repairs. Knives, small axes, chisels, and wooden mallets were common items. Many of these tools were made by blacksmiths, whose work was essential in Viking society. Iron tools were highly valuable. Although large blacksmith workshops sometimes existed in villages, smaller repairs and tool maintenance often happened inside or just outside the Longhouse.
A damaged blade or broken metal fitting could be reheated in the hearth fire and carefully reshaped. The rhythmic sound of hammer striking metal was familiar to many Viking households. Woodworking was another important craft practiced around the home. The forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark provided an abundance of timber. Skilled woodworkers used simple tools to transform logs into bowls, spoons, storage chests, and furniture. Wood was also used to make farming tools, wagon parts, and even components for ships. Inside the longhouse, wood shavings often collected on the floor near someone carving carefully with a knife. The scent of fresh wood mixed with the smoky air of the hearth. Another vital craft that filled the longhouse with activity was textile production. Clothing, blankets, and sails for ships all depended on wool and flax fibers. Women and sometimes older children spent hours spinning wool using drop spindles. The spindle twisted loose fibers into strong thread that could later be woven into cloth. Large upright looms were sometimes placed along the walls of the longhouse. These looms allowed long pieces of fabric to be produced. The work required patience and concentration. Thread had to be carefully arranged, and each row of woven fabric slowly built the finished cloth. The sound of weaving, the soft knocking of wooden tools, and the movement of threads was a familiar part of life inside the hall. Clothing made in Viking homes was durable and practical. Wool tunics, cloaks, trousers, and dresses protected people from cold weather. Leather shoes and belts were also produced through careful handcrafting. Leatherworking was another skill practiced near the longhouse. Animal hides from sheep, goats, and cattle were cleaned and treated through a process known as tanning. Once prepared, the leather could be cut and shaped into useful items such as shoes, bags, straps, and protective gear. These goods were essential for travel, farming, and daily life. Bone and antler were also valuable materials for Viking craftsmen. These materials were often carved into small tools like needles, combs, fishing hooks, and decorative objects. Some combs discovered by archaeologists show intricate patterns carved into their surfaces, demonstrating that even practical items could be beautifully designed. Jewelry making also occurred in some households, particularly among wealthier families or skilled artisans. Small metal brooches, rings, and decorative pins were crafted from bronze, silver, and sometimes gold. These items were not only decorative, but also served practical purposes. Brooches were used to fasten cloaks or dresses, making them essential pieces of clothing. Jewelry often reflected social status and personal identity. Within the longhouse, crafting activities were not isolated tasks. Family members often worked side by side near the fire. While one person spun thread, another might repair a fishing net or sharpen a knife. These shared tasks created a quiet rhythm of cooperation. Children growing up in these homes learned by watching and helping. A young boy might hold a piece of wood steady while an elder carved it. A young girl might practice spinning wool under the guidance of her mother. In this way, practical knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. The longhouse, therefore, functioned as a place of learning as well as production. Some households also stored trade goods within their homes. Viking traders traveled far beyond Scandinavia, visiting places like England, Ireland, and even the distant city of Constantinople. From these journeys, they brought back foreign goods, including glass beads, fine fabrics, spices, and precious metals. When these items appeared inside a longhouse, they must have seemed fascinating and exotic to family members who had never traveled far from their village. Such objects connected Viking homes to a wider world of trade and exploration. Even though the longhouse often looked simple from the outside, the work happening inside was complex and varied. Every tool crafted, every thread spun, and every piece of clothing sewn contributed to the survival and success of the household. This constant activity made the longhouse feel alive. The glow of the fire illuminated faces bent over careful work. Shadows moved across wooden beams, while tools quietly shaped the materials of everyday life. Yet, despite all the work and crafting happening inside these homes, the Longhouse was also a place where culture and tradition were preserved. Stories were told, songs were sung, and knowledge about the gods, the seasons, and the world beyond the village was shared with younger generations. These stories connected families not only to their ancestors, but also to the powerful figures of their mythology, including the thunder god Thor and the wise wanderer Odin. The Longhouse, therefore, functioned as a place of learning as well as production. Some households also stored trade goods within their homes. Viking traders traveled far beyond Scandinavia, visiting places like England, Ireland, and even the distant city of Constantinople. From these journeys they brought back foreign goods, including glass beads, fine fabrics, spices, and precious metals. When these items appeared inside a longhouse, they must have seemed fascinating and exotic to family members who had never traveled far from their village. Such objects connected Viking homes to a wider world of trade and exploration. Even though the longhouse often looked simple from the outside, the work happening inside was complex and varied. Every tool crafted, every thread spun, and every piece of clothing sewn contributed to the survival and success of the household. This constant activity made the longhouse feel alive. The glow of the fire illuminated faces bent over careful work. Shadows moved across wooden beams, while tools quietly shaped the materials of everyday life. Yet, despite all the work and crafting happening inside these homes, the longhouse was also a place where culture and tradition were preserved. Stories were told, songs were sung, and knowledge about the gods, the seasons, and the world beyond the village was shared with younger generations. These stories connected families not only to their ancestors, but also to the powerful figures of their mythology, including the thunder god Thor and the wise wanderer Odin. The longhouse, therefore, functioned as a place of learning as well as production. Some households also stored trade goods within their homes. Viking traders traveled far beyond Scandinavia, visiting places like England, Ireland, and even the distant city of Constantinople. From these journeys they brought back foreign goods, including glass beads, fine fabrics, spices, and precious metals. When these items appeared inside a longhouse, they must have seemed fascinating and exotic to family members who had never traveled far from their village. Such objects connected Viking homes to a wider world of trade and exploration. Even though the longhouse often looked simple from the outside, the work happening inside was complex and varied. Every tool crafted, every thread spun, and every piece of clothing sewn contributed to the survival and success of the household. This constant activity made the longhouse feel alive. The glow of the fire illuminated faces bent over careful work. Shadows moved across wooden beams, while tools quietly shaped the materials of everyday life. Yet, despite all the work and crafting happening inside these homes, the longhouse was also a place where culture and tradition were preserved. Stories were told, songs were sung, and knowledge about the gods, the seasons, and the world beyond the village was shared with younger generations. These stories connected families not only to their ancestors, but also to the powerful figures of their mythology, including the thunder god Thor and the wise wanderer Odin. The longhouse, therefore, functioned as a place of learning as well as production. Some households also stored trade goods within their homes. Viking
feasts, gatherings, and the social life of the longhouse. Although much of life inside a Viking longhouse was focused on work and survival, there were times when the quiet rhythm of daily tasks gave way to something far more lively. On special occasions, the longhouse transformed into the center of celebration for the entire community.
During the time historians call the Viking Age, gatherings inside longhouses played an important role in strengthening social bonds. These gatherings were not only moments of enjoyment, but also events that reinforced alliances, family connections, and community traditions across Scandinavia. One of the most important types of gatherings was a feast. Feasts often occurred during seasonal festivals, successful harvests, weddings, or the return of travelers from distant journeys. When such an event was planned, the longhouse had to be prepared carefully. Benches were arranged along the walls, and additional tables might be placed near the central fire. Large pots simmered with stew, while roasted meat cooked slowly over open flames. The smell of food filled the hall, mixing with the familiar scent of wood smoke. People from nearby farms and villages would arrive, bringing gifts or contributions of food and drink. Hospitality was extremely important in Viking culture. A host was expected to provide food and shelter for guests, even if doing so placed a strain on household supplies. Offering generosity to visitors strengthened one's reputation and built trust among neighbors. Once the feast began, the longhouse became a lively place. Bowls of food were passed from person to person. Bread, fish, meat, and dairy products filled the tables. Horn cups were raised as ale and mead flowed freely among the guests. Ale brewed from barley was a common drink in Viking homes, while sweet honey-based mead was often reserved for more special occasions. The sound of conversation filled the hall as people shared news from surrounding villages or spoke about recent events. Some guests might have traveled far, perhaps returning from trading voyages to distant lands such as England or Ireland. Their stories of unfamiliar towns, markets, and rulers fascinated listeners who had never left their homeland. Music was another important part of these gatherings. Musicians sometimes played simple instruments such as lyres, flutes, or drums. The rhythmic sound of music echoed through the wooden hall, while some guests sang traditional songs that had been passed down for generations. These songs often celebrated heroic deeds or legendary voyages. Storytelling was perhaps the most powerful part of a feast. Experienced storytellers or respected elders might stand near the fire and recite tales about famous warriors, daring sea journeys, or encounters with mythical creatures. These stories connected listeners to their cultural heritage and reminded them of the bravery and endurance valued in Viking society. Many of these tales included the gods who shaped Viking belief. Listeners heard stories of the thunder god Thor battling powerful giants, or the wise and mysterious god Odin wandering through the world in search of knowledge. For younger members of the household, these stories were both entertainment and education. They helped children understand the values of courage, loyalty, and wisdom that their society admired. Feasts also played a political role. In larger longhouses belonging to local chieftains, gatherings allowed leaders to strengthen alliances with neighboring families and warriors. Sharing food and drink created a sense of loyalty and mutual support. A chieftain who hosted generous feasts often gained respect and influence within the region. Sometimes decisions about trade, defense, or future voyages were discussed during these gatherings. Agreements made around the fire could shape the direction of entire communities. But not every feast was connected to politics or leadership. Many were simply celebrations of life itself. Weddings were particularly joyful events inside longhouses. Families from both sides gathered together to witness the union of a couple. Gifts were exchanged, vows spoken, and large meals shared late into the night. These marriages often strengthened bonds between families and ensured cooperation between farms. Seasonal festivals were another reason for celebration. The end of harvest season was especially important. After months of hard work in the fields, communities gathered to celebrate the successful storage of food for winter. Such gatherings gave people a chance to relax and enjoy the results of their labor. Some festivals included rituals or offerings to the gods, thanking them for good fortune or asking for protection in the coming months. Children attending these gatherings experienced a world very different from the quiet routines of ordinary days. The Longhouse filled with laughter, music, and movement as adults shared stories and raised their cups in celebration. For them, these moments likely became some of the most memorable parts of growing up. Even though Viking society is often remembered mainly for exploration and warfare, gatherings like these reveal another side of their culture, one built on community, hospitality, and shared tradition. Inside the Longhouse, people celebrated together, strengthening the relationships that helped them survive in a challenging environment. But eventually, the feasts would end. Guests returned to their homes, the fire burned lower, and the Longhouse slowly returned to its normal rhythm of daily life. But the memories of those gatherings lingered. Stories told during feasts were repeated for years afterward. Songs sung during celebrations continued to echo in the minds of those who had heard them. In this way, the Longhouse preserved not only food and warmth, but also the culture and identity of Viking communities. Yet, despite these joyful moments, life in the Viking world was never completely peaceful. The same warriors who laughed and celebrated inside the Longhouse might soon prepare for dangerous journeys across the sea. Weapons stored along the walls of the hall reminded everyone that travel, trade, and sometimes conflict were part of their world. And in the next part of the story, we will explore another hidden side of the Longhouse, the weapons, armor, and warrior culture that shaped the lives of many Viking men and influenced the future of their communities.
Weapons, warriors, and the warrior culture inside the Longhouse. While the Viking Longhouse was a place of family life, craft work, and celebration, it was also closely connected to another powerful part of Viking society, the warrior tradition. Along the wooden walls of many longhouses hung objects that reminded everyone of the dangers and ambitions that shaped the world during the Viking Age. Weapons were not hidden away in distant armories. In many homes across Scandinavia, they were stored openly inside the longhouse itself. A shield might rest against a wooden pillar. A spear could hang from a beam. Swords, axes, and helmets were often carefully placed inside storage chests, were displayed where they could be easily reached if needed. These weapons were tools of survival in a world where conflict could arise suddenly. The most common weapon in Viking society was the spear. Spears were relatively simple to make and required less iron than swords. A strong wooden shaft with a sharpened metal tip could be used for hunting as well as combat. Shields were equally important. Most Viking shields were round and made from wooden planks reinforced with a metal boss in the center. This metal dome protected the warrior's hand while allowing the shield to deflect blows from swords or axes. When many warriors stood side by side with their shields touching, they formed a powerful defensive wall known as a shield formation. Axes were another widely used weapon. Unlike simple wood-cutting tools, fighting axes were carefully balanced for combat. Their curved blades could strike with tremendous force. For many Viking warriors, the axe became a symbol of strength and courage. Swords, however, were the most prestigious weapons. Crafting a sword required significant skill and valuable metal, making them expensive items. Because of this, swords were often passed down through generations of a family. A well-made blade might carry a name and a long history of use. Inside the longhouse, such weapons were treated with respect. Young boys growing up in these homes often watched older warriors carefully maintain their gear. Blades were sharpened with stones, leather straps repaired, and shields inspected for cracks or weakness.
Through observation, children learn the importance of preparation. Training sometimes happened near the Longhouse as well. Boys practiced with wooden swords and shields, learning basic movements and defensive techniques. These exercises helped them develop the strength and coordination needed for adulthood. Although not every Viking became a warrior, the skills of combat were respected throughout society. Some men joined expeditions that traveled far beyond Scandinavia. Viking ships crossed the seas to trade, explore, and sometimes fight in distant regions such as England and Ireland. Other warriors traveled even farther, eventually reaching the great city of Constantinople, where some Vikings served as elite guards for foreign rulers. When these warriors returned home, the Longhouse once again became a place of storytelling. Sitting near the fire, they described distant lands, unfamiliar cultures, and dangerous battles. Listeners gathered closely, fascinated by stories of strange cities and powerful armies. These stories strengthened the reputation of successful warriors and inspired younger members of the household. Weapons inside the Longhouse therefore represented more than tools for fighting. They symbolized bravery, honor, and the possibility of adventure beyond the village. Yet warrior culture of the Vikings was not only about combat. It was also deeply connected to their beliefs about fate, courage, and the afterlife. Many Vikings believed that those who died bravely in battle might be welcomed into a magnificent hall in the afterlife, ruled by the god Odin. This hall, often described in stories, was said to be a place where fallen warriors would continue to feast and train for future battles. Another powerful figure in Viking belief was the thunder god Thor, whose strength and protection were admired by many warriors. These beliefs helped shape the warrior mindset. Courage and loyalty were highly valued qualities. A warrior who fought bravely earned respect not only from his companions, but also from future generations who would remember his deeds. Inside the Longhouse, weapons and stories worked together to preserve these ideals. But even warriors had responsibilities beyond fighting. Most Viking warriors were also farmers, craftsmen, or traders. Their lives were not spent entirely on battlefields or distant voyages. Much of their time was devoted to maintaining their homes, supporting their families, and contributing to their communities. The Longhouse remained their true center of life. Here they rested after journeys, repaired their equipment, and shared their experiences with family members. Children listened closely, absorbing lessons about courage, loyalty, and responsibility. At the same time, the presence of weapons inside the Longhouse reminded everyone that the Viking world could be unpredictable. A peaceful farm might suddenly face threats from rival groups or foreign raiders. Being prepared for danger was part of daily life. Yet, despite these realities, the Longhouse continued to serve as a place of warmth, safety, and connection. The fire in the center burned steadily, while the outside world shifted with changing seasons and uncertain events. Within those wooden walls, families continued their routines of cooking, crafting, storytelling, and raising the next generation. And while weapons and warrior stories played a powerful role in shaping Viking identity, there was another important force that influenced life inside the Longhouse: belief. The Vikings carried deep spiritual traditions that shaped how they understood nature, fate, and the mysteries of the world around them. Inside the Longhouse, small rituals, symbols, and sacred objects reflected those beliefs. And in the next part of the story, we will explore the spiritual side of Viking homes, the gods, rituals, and quiet traditions that connected the Longhouse to the unseen world of myth and faith.
Gods, rituals, and sacred traditions inside the Longhouse. Life inside a Viking longhouse was shaped not only by work, family, and survival, but also by a deep spiritual worldview. The people who lived in these homes believed that unseen forces influenced the world around them. Storms, harvests, illness, and good fortune were often connected to the will of powerful gods. During the era historians call the Viking Age, these beliefs formed an important part of daily life across Scandinavia. Although large temples and sacred outdoor sites existed in some places, many religious practices also took place inside the longhouse itself. The home was not only a shelter for the family, it could also serve as a quiet place for spiritual rituals and traditions. Near the central fire or along a wooden beam, a household might keep small carved figures representing the gods. These figures were sometimes made from wood, bone, or metal. They reminded the family of the powerful beings believed to watch over the world. Two of the most respected gods in Viking belief were Thor and Odin. Thor was widely admired as a protector of people and farms. With his legendary hammer, he was believed to control thunder and defend humanity against dangerous giants and chaotic forces. Many families looked to Thor for protection during storms or difficult times. Odin, on the other hand, was known as a god of wisdom, war, and mystery. He was often described in stories as a wandering figure seeking knowledge about the secrets of the universe. Inside the longhouse, families sometimes made small offerings to these gods. Offerings might include pieces of food, a small cup of ale, or a symbolic object placed near a carved figure. These acts were meant to show respect and ask for blessings in return. Such rituals were usually simple and quiet. They might take place during important moments, such as the start of a new farming season, the departure of a family member on a long journey, or the arrival of winter. These events reminded people that their lives were closely connected to the natural cycles of the world. Seasonal celebrations were particularly important. During the darkest months of the year, families gathered in the longhouse to celebrate the return of light after the winter solstice. Fires burned brightly, while food and drink were shared among family members and guests. These celebrations helped strengthen hope during the coldest and darkest period of the year. Other rituals were connected to harvest time. When crops were safely gathered and stored, families sometimes offered thanks to the gods for providing food that would help them survive the coming winter. Children growing up in Viking homes observed these traditions closely. They watched elders perform small rituals and listened carefully to the stories that explained the origins of the gods and the structure of the universe. These stories were part of a rich mythology that shaped how Vikings understood life and fate. According to these traditions, the universe itself was connected through a vast cosmic tree known as Yggdrasil. This enormous tree was believed to link different realms of existence, including the world of humans, the world of the gods, and other mysterious places beyond human understanding. Such ideas may have seemed distant and mythical, but they influenced everyday decisions. For example, when setting out on a journey, a traveler might ask for the protection of the gods. A farmer facing uncertain weather might hope for Thor's strength to bring rain or protect crops from storms. Even inside the longhouse, symbols of protection could sometimes be seen. Small hammer-shaped pendants representing Thor's hammer were occasionally worn as amulets. These items were believed to offer protection and strength to the person wearing them. Archaeologists have discovered many such pendants in Viking settlements across Scandinavia. Funeral traditions also reflected Viking beliefs about life and death. When someone passed away, the Longhouse community often gathered to honor the person's life. The dead were prepared carefully and buried with objects that might help them in the afterlife. In some cases, weapons, jewelry, or everyday tools were placed in the grave.
These items symbolized the belief that life continued beyond death in another realm. Inside the Longhouse, memories of those who had passed away remained part of family life. Stories about ancestors were shared with younger generations, keeping their legacy alive within the household. This connection to the past was extremely important. Families believed they were part of a long chain stretching back through many generations. The Longhouse itself often stood on land where ancestors had lived for years or even centuries. In this way, the building became more than a physical structure. It became a place where the living and the memory of the dead coexisted. The fire that burned at the center of the hall had likely warmed many generations before the current family. Each new generation continued the traditions they had inherited, maintaining rituals and beliefs that shaped their identity. The spiritual life of the Longhouse therefore blended quietly into everyday routines. Cooking, crafting, storytelling, and prayer-like rituals all happened within the same smoky hall. The boundaries between practical life and spiritual belief were not sharply divided. Instead, they existed side by side. For the people living inside these homes, the gods were not distant figures found only in temples or sacred forests. Their presence was felt within the daily rhythms of life. A storm outside might remind someone of Thor's power. A wise decision might be linked to Odin's influence. These beliefs gave meaning to the unpredictable challenges of life in the Viking world. Yet, even with their strong spiritual traditions, Viking families also relied on something equally important for survival: preparation. Because when winter arrived across Scandinavia, the Longhouse became a refuge against one of the most difficult seasons of the year. Snow, darkness, and freezing temperatures forced families to spend long months indoors, relying on the supplies they had carefully gathered during warmer seasons. And in the next part of the story, we will step deeper into those cold months and explore how Viking families survived the brutal winters inside their longhouses.
Surviving the brutal Viking winters inside the Longhouse. For the people living in the far northern lands of Scandinavia, winter was not simply a cold season. It was a long test of preparation, endurance, and cooperation. During the time historians call the Viking Age, families knew that the difference between comfort and hardship often depended on how well they had prepared their longhouse before the first snow arrived. As autumn ended, the landscape slowly changed. Days became shorter, the sun appeared lower in the sky, and cold winds swept across the valleys and fjords of Norway and the open plains of Denmark and Sweden. Frost began to cover the ground each morning. This was the signal that winter was coming. Inside the Longhouse, families started preparing carefully. Supplies that had been collected during the warmer months were brought indoors and stored safely. Wooden barrels and chests held dried fish, salted meat, grains, and preserved vegetables. These food stores would become the household's main source of nourishment until spring returned. The Longhouse itself also required preparation. Thick animal skins were placed over sleeping benches to provide warmth during cold nights. Additional firewood was stacked close to the building so it could be easily reached during snowstorms. Tools and farming equipment were repaired and stored until the ground thawed again. One of the most important elements for winter survival was the central fire. The hearth inside the Longhouse burned almost constantly during the cold months. It provided warmth for the entire household and allowed food to be cooked every day. Smoke slowly rose through openings in the roof, leaving the wooden beams darkened with soot after many seasons. Although the smoky air might seem uncomfortable to modern visitors, it actually helped preserve the wooden structure and keep insects away. Animals were sometimes brought into the Longhouse during the coldest periods. Sheep, goats, or even cattle might be sheltered at one end of the building.
Their body heat helped warm the interior, and their presence ensured they remained protected from harsh weather and predators outside. Of course, this meant the longhouse could become crowded and noisy, but the extra warmth and safety were worth the inconvenience. During winter, daily life moved at a slower pace. Farming work stopped once the ground froze, and travel between villages became more difficult due to snow and icy roads. Families, therefore, spent more time indoors. This time allowed them to focus on activities that were difficult to complete during the busy farming season. Clothing was repaired or newly woven, tools were sharpened, fishing nets were mended. Craft work became an important part of winter life. Women often continued spinning wool and weaving cloth, producing garments that would be needed for the following year. Men might carve wooden tools, repair sleds, or prepare equipment for future journeys. Children also spent more time inside the longhouse during winter. Without fields to run through or forests to explore, they stayed close to the warmth of the fire. This gave them more opportunities to listen to stories told by elders. These long evenings became the perfect time for storytelling. Legends about ancient heroes, sea voyages, and powerful gods were shared while the fire crackled and wind howled outside. Tales of the thunder god Thor and the wise wanderer Odin were especially popular during these dark winter nights. For children, these stories helped pass the time and teach lessons about courage, wisdom, and loyalty. For adults, storytelling strengthened the bonds between generations. Winter nights were long in the northern world. In some parts of Scandinavia, darkness could last for many hours each day. Without modern lighting, the glow of the hearth and small oil lamps provided the only illumination inside the longhouse. The soft light created moving shadows along the wooden walls. Despite the warmth inside, winter could still bring challenges. If food supplies ran low or illness spread through the household, the cold months became much more difficult. Families relied on careful planning and cooperation to avoid such problems. Neighbors sometimes helped one another during especially harsh winters. Sharing food or firewood could mean the difference between survival and hardship for smaller households. These acts of support strengthened community ties within Viking villages. Yet winter was not only a season of hardship, it also brought moments of calm reflection. With fewer outside tasks demanding attention, families had time to talk, remember past events, and plan for the future. Young people listened carefully as elders described past journeys, important decisions, and lessons learned through experience. This quiet exchange of knowledge helped prepare the next generation for adulthood. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned steadily while snow covered the landscape outside. The thick walls and turf roof protected the family from freezing winds, creating a small island of warmth in the cold northern world. Month after month, the household waited patiently for the return of longer days. Eventually, the snow would melt. Rivers would begin to flow again, and fields would slowly reveal the dark soil beneath the ice. With the arrival of spring, the quiet winter life of the longhouse would give way to the busy work of farming and travel once again. But before that moment arrived, winter left its mark on the lives of everyone inside the longhouse. It reminded them of the importance of preparation, cooperation, and resilience. These qualities allowed Viking communities to survive in one of the most challenging climates in Europe. And although the longhouse served as protection during these harsh months, it also held many personal stories within its wooden walls. Births, marriages, celebrations, and losses all unfolded inside these homes.
Birth, family life, and growing up inside the longhouse.
Inside the warm, smoky halls of Viking Longhouses, life unfolded in cycles that stretched across generations. These buildings were more than shelters from the cold winds of Scandinavia. They were places where families grew, where children took their first steps, and where elders shared the wisdom gathered through long lives. During the era known as the Viking Age, the Longhouse served as the center of family life. Nearly every important moment in a person's life happened within its wooden walls. Birth was one of the most significant events for any household. When a child was about to be born, women of the family gathered to assist the mother. These women might include sisters, mothers, aunts, or experienced neighbors who had helped with many births before. The men of the household usually stayed away during this time, leaving the task to those who understood the process best. The birth usually took place in a quieter section of the longhouse, away from the busiest parts of the hall. Although life inside the longhouse could be crowded, families tried to create a calm space for the mother and newborn child. Firelight flickered against the wooden beams, while the sounds of daily activity continued elsewhere in the home. Once the child was born safely, the household celebrated quietly. The arrival of a new baby meant the family would continue into another generation. In a world where survival was not always guaranteed, every healthy birth brought hope for the future. Naming the child was an important step. Viking families often chose names connected to their ancestors. This tradition helped preserve the memory of earlier generations and strengthened family identity. A newborn might be named after a grandparent or a respected relative whose qualities the family hoped the child would inherit. Some names also reflected the influence of the gods. Parents sometimes selected names that honored powerful figures such as Thor or the wise god Odin, believing that the child might receive strength or wisdom through that connection. As children grew, the Longhouse became their first school. There were no formal classrooms or written lessons for most Viking children. Instead, they learned by watching the adults around them. Every activity inside the household offered an opportunity for learning. Young boys might help their fathers gather firewood, care for animals, or repair fishing nets. These tasks taught responsibility and practical skills needed for adulthood. Girls often learned from their mothers and older women in the household. They practiced spinning wool, weaving cloth, and preparing food. Over time, they became skilled in the tasks that kept the longhouse running smoothly. Children also played games that helped them develop strength and coordination. Simple toys made from wood or bone have been discovered by archaeologists in Viking settlements. Small carved animals, miniature boats, and simple gaming pieces suggest that children enjoyed moments of play even in a hard-working society. Some games also prepared boys for future roles as warriors. They practiced mock battles using wooden sticks as swords or shields. Although these games were playful, they helped children become familiar with the movements and discipline expected of adult fighters. But childhood inside the longhouse was not only about learning practical skills. Storytelling played a powerful role in shaping young minds. During long evenings, especially in winter, children gathered near the central fire to listen to stories told by elders. These tales described heroic voyages, dangerous sea battles, and encounters with strange lands. Through these stories, children learned about the wider world beyond their village. Some stories focused on legendary heroes whose bravery and determination served as examples for younger generations. Others explained the actions of the gods and the mysteries of nature. The thunder rolling across the sky might be explained through the strength of Thor, while difficult decisions or moments of wisdom might be connected to the influence of Odin. These stories helped children understand the values of their society.
Courage, loyalty, wisdom, and respect for family were themes repeated again and again. As children grew into teenagers, their responsibilities increased. Boys began to accompany adults on longer fishing trips or hunting expeditions. Some might even travel with traders or warriors on journeys to nearby regions. These experiences allowed them to develop independence and confidence. Girls took on more responsibility within the household. They helped manage food supplies, care for younger children, and assist in large tasks such as preparing meals for gatherings or feasts. By observing their mothers and other women, they gradually learned how to manage a household of their own. Marriage was often the next major step in adult life. When young men and women reached adulthood, marriages were arranged or agreed upon with the involvement of families from both sides. These unions strengthened connections between households and farms. Wedding celebrations often took place inside the Longhouse, filling the hall with guests, food, and music. Through marriage, the Longhouse continued its role as the center of family life. New couples might remain in the household with older generations or build their own longhouse nearby. In either case, the traditions learned within the family continued to guide their lives. As years passed, children grew into adults and eventually became parents themselves. The same wooden beams that had witnessed their childhood games and early lessons now watched as they raised their own children within the same walls. This cycle of life continued for generations. The Longhouse preserved not only the daily routines of Viking families, but also their memories, traditions, and shared experiences. Within those smoky halls, the past remained present through stories, names, and customs passed from one generation to the next. Yet time eventually touched everyone. The elders who had once guided the household grew older, and their roles gradually changed. Their wisdom became one of the most valuable resources inside the Longhouse.
Elders, legacy, and the wisdom of the Longhouse. In every Viking Longhouse, elders held a special place. Their presence was a reminder that life was a cycle of generations, each dependent on the knowledge and experience of those who came before. During the Viking Age, elders were not sidelined as society grew younger. Instead, they were central to family life, providing guidance, teaching, and preserving the traditions that gave meaning to daily existence across Scandinavia. Elders had authority earned through years of experience. They were respected for surviving the harsh northern winters, leading successful harvests, and guiding younger members of the household through challenges. Their advice was sought for decisions that affected both family and community. The Longhouse itself often reflected this respect. The elder of the household, usually the oldest male or female, occupied a seat of honor near the fire. From this position, they could observe everyone in the hall and participate in daily activities without being overwhelmed by labor. This seat symbolized wisdom and oversight, reminding younger family members that guidance and patience were as vital as strength and skill. Storytelling was one of the most important ways elders shaped life inside the Longhouse. Sitting near the fire, they shared tales of heroes, gods, and past family members. These stories preserved the family's history and connected present generations with ancestors long gone. Heroes such as the thunder god Thor and the wise god Odin were frequent figures in these narratives, teaching lessons about courage, loyalty, and wisdom. But storytelling was not only entertainment. It served as an informal education system. Children and young adults learned about practical skills, morality, and societal expectations through these tales. Lessons about leadership, generosity, and vigilance were embedded in stories of legendary voyages or heroic deeds. Elders also played a vital role in resolving conflicts within the household.
Crowded longhouses and shared responsibilities could create tension. Arguments over chores, food, or personal space were inevitable. In such cases, the elder acted as an arbiter, offering fair guidance to maintain harmony. Their judgments carried weight because they were informed by experience and a deep understanding of family dynamics. The Longhouse was also a repository for family memory. Elders remembered births, marriages, deaths, and migrations. They kept track of land, livestock, and important agreements with neighbors. This knowledge was crucial, especially in times of scarcity or crisis. Decisions about resource allocation, travel, or alliances often depended on the elders' memory and counsel. Rituals and religious practices were another responsibility of elders. While younger family members learned the beliefs and stories of the gods through observation, elders ensured that these traditions were maintained correctly. They guided the family in making offerings, observing festivals, and performing small daily rituals that honored powerful deities and the cycles of nature. The wisdom of elders also extended beyond the immediate household. They often advised neighboring families, helped resolve village disputes, and acted as links between generations across communities. Their guidance shaped local society, preserving social cohesion and cultural continuity in a world that could otherwise be unpredictable and harsh. As the years passed, the Longhouse bore witness to countless cycles of life. Children grew into adults, families expanded, and the lessons of the past guided new generations. The building itself, with its sturdy timber beams, turf walls, and central hearth, stood as a silent observer of these human dramas, connecting the past, present, and future within a single space.
The Longhouse as a hub of economy and trade. While the Viking Longhouse was primarily a family home, it was also an important center of economic activity. Life inside these buildings blended domestic tasks with practical work that sustained both the household and the wider community. During the Viking Age, longhouses across Scandinavia were not isolated. They were hubs where food, goods, and labor intersected, connecting families to local markets and distant trading networks. Inside the longhouse, craftwork often doubled as commerce. Textiles spun from wool or flax were not only used for clothing within the household, but could also be traded with neighbors or traveling merchants. Skilled weavers produced strong cloth for sails, bags, or trading goods that traveled along rivers or across the sea. Woodworking products were another source of economic activity. Bowls, spoons, chests, and small furniture items could be sold or exchanged for tools, metal, or other necessities. Carved decorations added value, showing that aesthetic appeal mattered as much as function. Metalworking was highly significant. Blacksmithing could produce tools, weapons, and household items, all essential for survival. A well-crafted axe, knife, or spear could be used, gifted, or traded. Even minor repairs to metal tools were often done inside or near the longhouse, keeping resources in circulation within the local economy. Animal products were crucial for trade. Families raised livestock not only for food, but for wool, hides, and dairy. These goods could be sold, bartered, or exchanged, providing flexibility when resources were scarce. Fish, particularly from coastal communities, became a staple commodity. Dried or smoked fish could travel long distances, making it one of the most widely traded items in the Viking world. The longhouse often served as a small storage facility for these goods. Wooden chests, barrels, and lofts kept trade items safe and dry. Careful organization inside the hall ensured that resources could be accessed efficiently, whether for family use or for trade. Trade also brought foreign goods into the longhouse. Vikings traveled far across Europe and beyond, visiting places such as England, Ireland, France, and even the markets of Constantinople. From these journeys, they returned with items not found locally.
glass beads, spices, fine fabrics, and precious metals. When these exotic goods arrived, the Longhouse became a place of fascination and commerce. Families might sell, gift, or trade these items locally, creating connections that extended far beyond the village. Children and young adults could see, touch, and learn about faraway cultures without leaving their home. The Longhouse also functioned as a center of skill sharing. Neighbors and visiting craftsmen often worked together inside or near the hall, exchanging techniques for weaving, metalworking, or carpentry. Knowledge became a form of wealth, passing quietly from one family to another. In some cases, the Longhouse became a meeting place for local agreements. Farmers could negotiate grazing rights, trade surpluses, or collaborate on shared projects. Decisions about collective security or village defense might also be discussed within its walls. These gatherings reinforced community cohesion and allowed families to coordinate survival strategies during challenging times. Even the central fire played a role in economic life. Its warmth allowed work to continue through long winters. Crafting, repairing tools, and preparing goods could all happen simultaneously, creating a rhythm of productivity that ensured both domestic stability and trade readiness. The importance of the Longhouse in the economy extended beyond its immediate walls. By serving as a hub for production, storage, and exchange, it linked local families to regional markets and, through Viking voyages, to distant lands. Goods produced inside the hall could influence trade hundreds or even thousands of miles away, creating a web of economic activity grounded in a single home. Thus, the Viking Longhouse was not simply a dwelling, it was an engine of livelihood. Within its walls, work, craft, and commerce existed alongside family life, storytelling, and spiritual practice. This blending of functions made the Longhouse a resilient, adaptable space capable of supporting generations through the challenges of both everyday life and wider economic change.
The Longhouse and the spirit of Viking exploration. Viking longhouses were not only homes, workshops, and centers of local trade. They were also the starting point for journeys that would reach across oceans and continents. Life inside these wooden halls nurtured the skills, knowledge, and ambition that allowed Viking families to explore distant lands. During the Viking Age, longhouses across Scandinavia were deeply connected to seafaring life, shaping a culture of exploration, adventure, and maritime skill. Even before a ship touched the water, preparation often began inside the longhouse. Family stored supplies such as dried fish, salted meat, grains, and barrels of water that would sustain crews during long voyages. Tools for repair and navigation, wooden compasses, ropes, spare sails, and simple measuring devices were carefully kept near the hearth, ready for use. Every item reflected a household's readiness for travel and survival. Craftsmanship played a critical role. Woodworking skills honed inside the longhouse were directly applied to shipbuilding. Carpenters and craftsmen practiced precision and patience when creating smaller boats or repairing oars, planks, and fittings. Young boys often learned the basics of seamanship while helping with these tasks, gaining knowledge that would serve them on future expeditions. Storytelling within the longhouse also fueled exploration. Elders shared tales of daring voyages, distant cities, and strange peoples. Stories of the great trading hub of Constantinople, bustling ports in England, or fertile lands along the rivers of Russia inspired curiosity and ambition. Through these narratives, children and young adults learn not only geography, but also the potential rewards and dangers of the wider world.
Religious beliefs influenced exploration as well. Many Vikings believed that the gods, particularly Odin, favored courage and boldness. Asking for divine protection before departure was a common practice. Offerings or brief rituals performed inside the Longhouse helped travelers feel that their journey was sanctioned and safeguarded by higher powers. Family involvement remained central. Often multiple generations participated in the preparations for a voyage. Fathers and sons checked ship gear, while mothers packed supplies and ensured that domestic responsibilities were secured during their absence. Longhouses were places where the logistics of exploration were carefully coordinated, balancing the household's survival with the promise of adventure and trade. Trade and diplomacy were often intertwined with exploration. Many Viking voyages were motivated not only by curiosity, but also by commerce. Goods produced inside the Longhouse, textiles, metal tools, and crafted items could be exchanged in faraway markets, extending the household's influence beyond its immediate surroundings. In return, exotic goods from distant lands enriched the Longhouse, connecting local life with a global network of trade and culture. The Longhouse also nurtured the warrior skills needed for travel. Preparations for voyages often included practicing with weapons and armor stored within the hall. Even young members of the household learned defensive techniques, ensuring that crews were ready to protect themselves in unfamiliar or hostile environments. Social bonds formed inside the Longhouse translated into cooperative efforts on expeditions. Family members and trusted neighbors, trained together in craft, navigation, and defense, became crews capable of managing long journeys across the North Sea, the Baltic, or even into the rivers of Eastern Europe. These journeys tested skills learned under the wooden beams and by the central hearth. Through all of this, the Longhouse remained a symbol of security and identity. Returning from a voyage, sailors and traders were greeted with warmth and celebration, their experiences becoming the latest stories shared near the hearth. Children heard firsthand about distant lands, unusual customs, and remarkable events, inspiring the next generation to follow in the footsteps of their ancestors. Ultimately, the Longhouse was more than a home. It was the foundation of a seafaring culture. It provided safety, nurtured skill, preserved knowledge, and inspired ambition. Every journey began and ended there, linking the physical structure of the hall to the far-reaching influence of Viking exploration. In the final part of this story, we will uncover the enduring legacy of the Viking Longhouse, how these remarkable structures influence not only the lives of those who lived in them, but also the broader culture, memory, and history of Scandinavia for generations to come.
The enduring legacy of the Viking Longhouse. After centuries of use, the Viking Longhouse became more than a physical structure. It transformed into a symbol of resilience, community, and cultural identity. During the Viking Age, these buildings shaped daily life across Scandinavia, but their influence extended far beyond their timber walls, leaving a lasting mark on history, architecture, and collective memory. One of the most enduring legacies of the Longhouse was its role in preserving family and community traditions. Generations of Vikings were born, raised, and passed away within these halls. Births, marriages, feasts, storytelling, and the passing down of practical skills all occurred in one central location. The Longhouse became a living archive, a place where knowledge, both mundane and sacred, was transmitted from one generation to the next. Craft and skill, honed inside the Longhouse, influenced the wider world. Textiles, metalwork, and woodworking not only sustained the household, but also contributed to trade networks reaching far beyond Scandinavia. Objects created within longhouse walls, tools, weapons, jewelry, and textiles traveled across Europe and even to the Byzantine Empire, carrying the mark of Viking craftsmanship to distant lands. The Longhouse also preserved the warrior and exploratory spirit of the Vikings. Men and women trained, prepared, and launched journeys from these homes, connecting family life to the wider world of voyages, raids, and trade. Knowledge gained from these expeditions, geography, navigation, and diplomacy, returned with travelers and enriched the Longhouse, linking it to global experiences even in a time before modern communication. Social organization, another aspect nurtured within the Longhouse, had lasting cultural significance. Elders maintained wisdom and order, resolving conflicts and teaching young members essential values. Feasts and rituals reinforced bonds, ensuring that both family and community cohesion endured, even during harsh winters or times of scarcity. These practices shaped the structure of Viking society and influenced how future generations understood governance, kinship, and cooperation. Archaeological discoveries today highlight the ingenuity of longhouse construction. Thick timber frames, turf insulation, and central hearths demonstrate practical solutions to survival in harsh northern climates. These designs influenced later Scandinavian architecture, including farmhouses and communal halls in the medieval period. Even centuries later, echoes of the Longhouse appear in building techniques that prioritize warmth, efficiency, and multifunctional living space. The spiritual and cultural practices preserved inside the Longhouse also left a lasting imprint. Mythology, rituals, and beliefs about gods like Thor and Odin remain central to Scandinavian identity, surviving even as societies transitioned to Christianity. Stories passed down in longhouses contributed to rich literary and oral traditions that continue to captivate historians, writers, and enthusiasts today. Moreover, the longhouse became a symbol of resilience and adaptation. Life in Scandinavia was challenging. Harsh winters, unpredictable weather, and scarce resources demanded ingenuity. The longhouse embodied the ability of Viking families to thrive despite these challenges. Its multifunctional design, accommodating shelter, work, ritual, and social activity, stands as a testament to human resourcefulness. Even in the modern imagination, the Viking Longhouse inspires fascination. Reconstructions in museums, archaeological sites, and media portrayals emphasize the hall's central role in Viking culture. They remind us that these buildings were not merely homes. They were the stage for the complex, interconnected lives of a society that valued craft, family, exploration, and courage. Ultimately, the Viking Longhouse was a microcosm of Viking world. Inside its wooden walls, people lived, worked, celebrated, mourned, learned, and planned for the future. From the rhythmic craft of daily life to the dramatic ventures across distant seas, the Longhouse was at the center of every experience. It preserved memory, skill, and culture, leaving an enduring legacy that continues to shape how we understand the Vikings today. The story of the Longhouse reminds us that architecture is never just about buildings. It is about the lives, values, and histories that unfold within them. Through smoke, firelight, and timber beams, the Viking Longhouse remains a symbol of human endurance, ingenuity, and the deep connections that link generations across time and space. This concludes the 14-part exploration of the hidden world inside Viking Longhouses, revealing a complex society where family, craft, faith, and adventure intertwined within the warmth and shadow of these remarkable halls.